Welcome to World of Soundtracks, a podcast where we explore storytelling aspects in films and TV through music. Whether it is comparing book adaptations, observing themes over a series, or microanalyzing the choice of instruments, we look at how the story is told and moves us. I am your host, Ruth Mudge, and today we have an interview with composer Dominik Scherrer. Today's episode features an interview with composer Dominik Scherrer. Dominik's music can be heard on some of the finest dramas made in recent years that have earned him 2 Ivor Novello Awards, a Primetime Emmy nomination, and a further 4 Ivor Novello nominations. Dominik's recent projects include the BBC PBS series Miss Austen, starring Keeley Hawes, the crime thriller Protection, produced by New Pictures for ITV, the BBC HBO thriller The Tourist, the BBC One series Boat Story, and Mammoth Screen's The Serpent. Born into a musical family, Dominik moved to London from Switzerland at the age of 19, where he has resided since. Amongst his first works as a composer were 2 operas for the screen. The second, Hell for Leather, premiered at Sundance Festival and has gone on to win 10 international awards. He has also written for acclaimed British drama series, including 6 seasons of Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, and 5 seasons of the Victorian crime drama Ripper Street, which earned him his first Ivor Novella. He's a frequent collaborator with director Aisling Walsh, scoring her BAFTA-nominated An Inspector Calls, the BAFTA-winning Elizabeth is Missing, and Miss Austen, which is the primary focus of this interview today. Dominik has also composed performance music for the theater, as well as sound design and music for fine art, notably with artist Suki Chan. I'm delighted to bring this interview to you where we talk about his career and delve into writing for period dramas, especially Miss Austen, which just finished airing in the US on PBS, and you can also find it on PBS Passport. You may notice that my voice is recovering from a cold in the interview, but I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. And without further ado, here's Dominik Scherrer. Welcome to World of Soundtracks. Our guest is Dominik Scherrer, and we're going to be talking about Miss Austen. But my first question that I always like to ask everybody is, what is the first soundtrack or score that captured your imagination when you were a kid or a teenager?
Wow, that's good to know. Thanks for having me on first. And that's the first soundtrack. You know, I think the first movies actually that my parents took me to was Charlie Chaplin, and then of course he wrote some of the music and some of the songs, you know, so that was always my first big cinema experience. And then, you know, I think anyone out of my generation, you can't really discount Star Wars because that's the first time you sat in a cinema and you had the, you know, Dolby stereo experience and the brass coming from everywhere in the cinema. And it was just a sort of big cinematic experience. And then maybe I think quite soon after that came the awareness of the Sergio Leone movies scored by Morricone. So those, you know, where the music is, you know, obviously quite upfront and very memorable.
You were born in Switzerland, correct?
Correct.
Did you see Star Wars in English? Did you see it in a different language? Was it dubbed at all?
I can't actually remember, but they do dub films there. There, you normally have the choice between, you know, having a dubbed version or the original language. And the Star Wars, I can't remember because I was listening to the music.
Sure. Who cares about the dialogue? It's the music, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And were those the projects that inspired you to then write your own music, or was there something else that inspired you to head towards your career, essentially?
Yeah, then I think this was kind of childhood experiences, and they were fantastic. But then I think for me to sort of think of myself, I mean, because you don't really sort of sit in the cinema, watch Star Wars and think like, oh, I can do that, you know, sort of. And it's maybe more because then I started to get more into art house cinema. As I was growing up, and then seeing, I don't know if you know Peter Greenaway, who did a lot of British films and who always used Michael Nyman to score his films. Michael Nyman, who did, most famously then The Piano, but he really became famous through Peter Greenaway's films. And, it was a more, slightly more offbeat way of looking at scoring and having a more this sort of minimalist, American minimalist style mixed with European minimalist style. And then I sort of think this is a really interesting way of bringing image and music together, because if you have seen films like Z and Two Notes or Drowning by Numbers, it's a really dynamic and an unusual way of scoring. And then perhaps the other one was more on the electronic side. So this is maybe the movies of Werner Herzog, like Aguirre, that had basically these, krautrock electronic soundtracks. And this is actually what I then started to do myself. This was quite Werner Herzog inspired, and, these sort of big synthetic soundscapes. Now, the problem is I didn't know any filmmakers at the time, and I really wanted to do these scores, so I made my own films, which kind of then gave me some films to score,
Sure.
So that's what I started to do. Sometimes there were quite simple things like shooting on VHS tape, something in the woods, and then they started to get more ambitious, like adaptations of romantic novels and more abstract art sort of scenarios. But anyway, they mainly gave me a kind of platform to explore this whole film scoring thing.
Is that love of creating soundscape one of the reasons why you've done some work with an artist, right? Suki
Chan.
Yeah, that kind of creating an atmosphere type of situation?
Well, I mean, no, I guess when I say soundscape, I mean, like, rather than having a sort of classical piece of music that is, I don't know, a bit like a kind of mini sonata or something, to have more ambient scoring, which is done a lot these days, of course, so sometimes that can be quite exciting and, something that's more based on the sonics and on the sounds, where you work on the sound rather than big thematic material,
right.
So in a way, of course, we always need both,
So you mentioned American minimalism versus European minimalism. I'm not actually that familiar with the difference between the two. Are you able to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, in fact, I read books about this. So there is American minimalism, Steve Reich, Philip Glass, that school of music. And then in Europe, you had really, actually, then Michael Nyman, I guess, was one of the exponents of European minimalism, Wim Martens from Holland. So I think it's, in a way, I think the European version is maybe a bit more, a bit less radical, I would say.
That's really interesting. Being an American, I mostly hear about the Americans, so it's always interesting to just really...
Well, I think it probably had to do more with the people who started it, so it was more of a sort of statement. And because I think before that, a lot of European music, particularly coming from Germany and, the kind of post-war, was radical and was actually almost difficult to listen to for a lot of people. So in a way, then I think this whole new way of looking at classical music was a bit of a reaction.
And then there's the holy minimalism side of things, which is also European, of Arvo Pärt and Goretzky.
True.
And who's the other one? John Tavener. They go in a totally different direction. But
would you call it minimalism?
I would call it mostly minimalism.
Okay.
In that genre. Yeah. That's the musical nerd side of things. What brought you to the UK? Was it work? Was it school?
I came to study in London. Also, I actually left Switzerland even before I went to Hamburg. It's just at that time, Switzerland, to me, as I was sort of growing up, teen, felt too small and too provincial, which it may have been at the time. It definitely isn't now, but at the time I felt that way, and I felt I needed to, and I just couldn't find other people to do my stuff with, and so I wanted to leave, and then I ended up in London, and I've immediately found lots of people to do projects with, and obviously studying was exciting and all that. So and I sort of knew that I would just stay in London really once I arrived, and I've been here ever since.
That's awesome. What's one of your favorite things that you like to do or experience in London?
Well, obviously, there's lots of things that everyone knows that are exciting. So apart from work, because I love working here, well, I come back to that later, but working here is fantastic. And I love being here. And also, I don't really have to urge to go to, I don't know, live in the countryside or something. I'm a more urban person, so I love big cities. So apart from working, there are great things, the Proms, which is the BBC, classical music festival, which is one of the fantastic things about London. So that's like over 2 months of unbelievable classical concerts every night for £6, like whatever, $8 a ticket, and you can see the Berlin Philharmonic, you can see everyone you'd wish for, So and it's exciting. And then, of course, culturally, I think it's one of the really best places to be and see a lot of interesting shows,
Sure.
So, and I think we need that as musicians,
Yes, the music scene is remarkable. One day I'll make it out to the Proms in the right time.
And so in terms of work, one of the things I like here is, I like working with musicians. I like recording and, and collaborating with people. And here you don't really have these separated worlds of classical and contemporary and pop and jazz. And so if somebody plays, they often play several genres at the same time, and it's really common. And for example, in Switzerland, when I grew up, it was very much classical musician. They would actually sort of think quite possibly badly of jazz, or they will certainly think badly of pop music and all that. And I believe it's probably changed there, but here it's always been very much more free flowing. And in terms of music, I think that's it's exciting, for everyone.
Yeah, I think here it's even in the classical world, because I'm a cellist, so I went to the conservatory, and yes, there was a little bit of the mindset of classical versus everything else. But I think now it has changed a bit, which is wonderful, because you need to have the breadth of genres to really appreciate all kinds of things in music.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and also then, maybe some like a sort of snobbish classical musician, they will play this and that in the cello, but they may still be at home listening to Lady Gaga, but they don't bring the two together, they think, but this is just me listening to music in the kitchen, and go like, well, no, it's not really. This is music, just like the Elgar Concerto is as well, So
exactly. All right. I am curious. You've written for a lot of mysteries over the years. Miss Marple, which I actually loved. I didn't realize it was you at the time, but lovely, the series. Ripper Street. I mean, so many different ones. And even Miss Austen has a mystery to it, because it's one of the great real life mysteries of why did Cassandra burn Jane's letters. So you still have a mystery element to it. Are there any specific musical tropes that you find yourself using, or do you try to really make sure that each project is a little different in having that kind of mystery or sneaking around type aspect in your different projects?
Yes, and also I think every time you finish, basically I think you want to do it different each time, because times change as well, styles change, but also I think each time you finish something, you feel like, I've done that. So you then want to explore new ways, can I be more subtle about it, or can I be bolder about it? And maybe you find out about some different harmonies you can use to evoke this and that. So basically you're always on the lookout for new ways of doing it. Yeah, so I would never. I mean, of course, probably when you are in the end, when you are under pressure, and sometimes you have to finish something, you have a few weapons in your arsenal that will always work, but you try first to do other stuff.
That makes sense. One of our listeners, her name is Lori, she was wondering, how do you juggle being audience friendly and yet reminiscent of the period for your period dramas? I think she was referring especially to Miss Austen, but that's true for several of your projects, of trying to balance how much do I want to be from the period versus still feel very modern and relevant.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a funny one because sometimes I remember, like you mentioned Ripper Street earlier, and the Daily Mail, which you may be aware of, is a kind of quite a very conservative paper, but anyway, they review television as well, of course, and we have to live with that. So they criticized the music heavily in Ripper Street because they said, no, this is, all you would have at the time of Ripper Street is as a barrel organ and I can't remember what else, I don't know, another instrument, but imagine, so this would be the Daily Mail version of Ripper Street, is to have a sort of gritty, bloody murder mystery scored with barrel organ. So so then that would fit in. So that's not going to work.
No, yeah.
So then you have to find, but you each time you pick something that is interesting. So I'll come back to Miss Austen in a moment, but just staying with Ripper Street, for example, in fact, quite a lot of research went into it. So Ripper Street is set in the 1890s in London. So at the time, this was a place with a lot of immigrants, like it is now. And the East End, actually one of the primary groups of immigrants was Irish. So there is obviously some Irish elements, and also Irish being very strong musically. It's something you would have heard on the streets. Then in terms of instruments, yes, actually banjo was being played because banjo is a loud instrument and it can be heard in a music hall. So music hall, then you pick up just little sort of elements, and then so it still feels sort of associated with the period. But I think it's not so much about being audience friendly, but I think people now, we want to create a more cinematic experience, so you want something that is maybe harder hitting and, has, whatever, bigger bass. But then also this is film scoring, so you want some elements that can sit better in the background, etc. So in a way, it's not, you can't necessarily compare it anyway with music that would have been played at the time, because it's a very different thing. But I love taking elements from the period, and I always research those periods quite extensively, because there is always something then that you can come across that will inspire an element in the score, whether this is instrumentation, harmonically, or structurally. But this is always my first sort of port of call, or sometimes it's also the locations, depending where it's playing. So, for example, for Miss Austen, again, I mean, it's two periods, but one of the big things is, of course, Jane Austen herself was quite an accomplished pianist, but she actually liked playing more like folk tunes, So I think she wasn't really playing Beethoven, and I mean, I think a little bit, but I think she, a lot of popular folk tunes or just songs at the time that everyone played in the house, that was a great way of. So in Miss Austen, we do have quite a lot of piano and solo piano, and that alludes a little bit to Jane Austen playing, and some of the harmonies, some of it is quite folky, so rather than high classicism, which would have been the music of the time. But again, it's not really to make it more audience friendly again. Sure. I think it's just a way of making it more cinematic,
Absolutely. Had you read any Austen? Had you seen any Austen adaptations, or was this your first entry into Austen.
If you live in England, and you will have seen like 10 Austen adaptations,
Sure.
you know, and I guess the most recent one that I saw was because my partner, she's a costume designer, so she designed the very controversial Persuasion, the Netflix.
Oh, yes.
Dakota Johnson. So of course I saw loads of that, you know,
I'm
because
sure.
she designed it, and lots of the, you know, discussions with you know, Dakota Johnson and all that. And then, you know, there's some great ones, you know, Sense and Sensibility from the 90s was a great one.
Yes.
And yeah, there's some of the TV series here, of course, are very popular. I don't know. Yeah, for me, I think out of my favorite out of them all probably would be the Sense and Sensibility, with, you know, the one with Kate Winslet.
Written by Patrick Doyle, the music,
Yeah.
that one.
Yes. Yeah.
Emma Thompson. That was my first one. So that's definitely a favorite of mine for sure. It was one of the reasons I was interested. I've talked a lot about adaptations for Jane Austen over the years, and it feels like there's 3 kind of unwritten rules that all the composers seem to follow, and you followed right along with it. And I wasn't sure if there's like this little list somewhere that all of you guys.
Now I'm curious.
Yeah, one of them is that you have to have a piano or a harp or both, which makes sense with Jane being a pianist. A lot of her heroines play those instruments. The other one is...
Well, no, and it's not only that, but of course, that's when piano became really big. You know, that's where, you know, so it was kind of, the pianoforte was only just around, and then you had the kind of early Beethoven, blah, blah, all that sort of, so that was really...
That was the instrument.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That totally makes sense. The other one is just how it's used. A lot of it is for traveling. So if you're going in a carriage, if you're moving back and forth, or if it's accompanying letters. And yours is all about letters. So it fits really well in there. And then the other one is, even though the harmonies may be different, whether it's trying to imitate Beethoven or minimalism, there is kind of a structure of what instruments to use as far as strings, you know, flute, clarinet, things like that. You're very rarely going to have a lot of brass, a lot of percussion, because it just doesn't quite seem to fit. So you're going to get your rhythmic elements more from your piano,
strings.
your harp, your strings.
Yeah.
So even though, again, whether it's Beethoven or, that's just a very interesting kind of almost agreement, which I think there was one Northanger Abbey which used saxophone, and it really threw a lot of people off, because you just go, that's almost a little too much. But then you have a little bit here and there, and one or two other composers have done this, where it's like a little bit of synthetic add-ons, but it fits because much more of it is kind of later on when Jane is dying. And there's a little bit more of a kind of a reverb effect.
I think those sounds are probably all generally generated with the actual acoustic recorded material, you know, rather than like adding a synthesizer or something, you know. So it feels like organically coming from that. I mean, the thing is, you know, what you are saying with I mean, I could be specifically for Jane Austen adaptations, but also I would say that's very much the sort of sound of British period drama. It's sort of piano and strings in a way. And it's probably true because the big brass and percussion is just hard. It's somehow hard to imagine with these sort of, if you are just in a village in Hampshire, you just don't really think of big drums and trombones. It's just not that kind of place. Yeah, but it could be, you know, maybe sometimes one is wrong as well, you know. So it's interesting. What you're saying. I mean, maybe we should do a Jane Austen adaptation
with
big percussion.
Yeah, with percussion. I think Samuel Sim used some good French horn. There's some French horn stuff.
Yes,
and so there's a little bit of that. This is the third time you've worked with the director, correct, Aisling?
That's right. Yeah, Aisling Walsh.
Did she bring you into the project initially?
She did.
What was it like to work with someone that you've worked with before?
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, I know also that she is just always interested in the sort of core of the story. So it's the subtext, I guess. And she's not interested in sort of stylistic embellishment. And it's just sort of whether, in a way, it all has to work emotionally for her. I think that's the main thing. And, you know, because sometimes you work with other people and sometimes with producers, and I send out a whole draft of an episode or a film, and then all I get back is notes like, can we start this cue 2 seconds later, can we start this 3 seconds earlier, blah blah, and I go like, yes, I can do that, that's fine, but do you realize I've just completely changed your film with the music? But it can be quite difficult for a lot of people to engage in this conversation on a sort of emotional level. And with Aisling, it's, in a way, it's all about that, the sort of how it works emotionally. And in a way, she's sort of, not taking any sort of, it sort of has to be pretty spot on. So I like that,
Well, it worked. Yeah. I cried like a baby in the last episode. So all the emotions definitely were there.
Okay, good.
I have several different questions about a little bit more of the specifics of the music. One is Cassandra's theme. That's kind of one of the big themes of the film. Has a little bit of a triplet and then kind of holding out longer. And I noticed there's like a wonderful bookend of the beginning and the end, of hearing it at the beginning and the end and then throughout. Did that theme purposely have some space to kind of fill in some of the other themes as well? It's like a longer note. Da, 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 da.
Yeah.
It's not a very. It's not a busy theme. It feels very calm in some ways.
I guess it was just written like that. I guess it wasn't really designed, for having the space later on. So it was more, I guess it felt we just needed a sort of simpler melody. And in a way, yes, it is Cassandra's theme, but it's also their theme. I mean, it's almost the theme of the series.
Sure.
So but it then sort of became her theme because she is the engine in the story. I think when you have a sort of a simpler theme, it's easier to then have it in very quite different arrangements and different settings, so it's almost it sort of starts with a more melodic side of it, but then for quite a while we only really hear, in a way, its harmonic sort of drive, without the top line. And I just find it's quite important to hold these things together by, having that kind of thematic strand going through it. And then towards the end, for example, it sort of just runs on this sort of triplet theme that actually then, what we started to find that we needed to, when you have new characters come in, it's good to sort of give them a little bit of a new thing. For example, her first big love, the guy who died on his overseas trip.
Yeah.
And so that is a bit like a new theme, but then actually later on we find that becomes, in a way, embedded in the Cassandra theme, and at the end it is, so because it all becomes part of her experience, her life in a way.
Did you try to have a different theme for some of the different characters like Isabella and Jane, or was it more using specific instruments at certain times? Or did you really want to focus on Cassandra?
Yeah. No, I mean, Isabella we have, but it's not so much, it's not like, this is Isabella, but it's more about her journey and the things that happen, then the death of her father, and then the potential relationship with the doctor that eventually gets, fulfilled, but we don't. Yeah, I shouldn't give that away.
Well,
but anyway,
this probably won't come out until afterwards. It'll take me a little time to edit. So
okay, all right. And so it's I don't always do themes for characters, because also, first, it's a bit like Mickey Mouse in a way that, you know, it's not about the characters, but because also as soon as because the characters, you always have two characters on the screen anyway. So which one do you use? Do you use the one of character A or character B or blah blah, or do you start to do a mix of them? So it's more, I see it more of the theme of somebody's journey, or sometimes it can be almost a theme of, like, I call them meta themes, like that are maybe about loss or love, or I don't know, something else in the story that's important. For example, in Ripper Street, because there was a lot of death in that series, you know. So and there are a lot of characters, and in a way, it made no sense to have, like, you know, 300 different themes, you know. So it's sort of so these kind of meta themes helped to unify the whole story. So, and again, similarly with this, you know, we have some themes that, you know, can almost apply to more than one character at the same time.
that makes sense, because it feels like the majority of the time with Isabella, it felt more like a loss or a grief theme, because that's what she was going through, and then kind of overlapping with Cassandra's grief and remembrances at the same time. So it did feel a little less like Isabella's theme, but more of like that loss that she was going through at the same time. I was very intrigued by your use of 7 in their traveling to Hampshire and back. That's not something I usually hear in an Austen adaptation. It was fun. It was like, it was probably one of the happiest pieces in that deal. Did you have any specific inspirations for that 1 2 1 2 1 2 3?
Well, you see, I'll use that quite a lot. You can be glad it's not 13 or 17, you know. So 7 is actually all right. And somehow I always find they have a sort of nice propelling forward, you know, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm glad you noticed. I think some other people, they're not even, they find it actually quite danceable, you know, but if they knew it was 7, they go like, oh really, you know. So so I didn't really want to make a statement of it, but it's almost more, I often think of in these kind of rhythms anyway, and I write a lot of, you know, a lot of action scenes I do in 7, 9, 11. It's a sort of bouncy, and then you notice that the leaving Hampshire stays in 7, 8.
The different feel of instruments, but I thought that was really fun, and it wasn't over the head. It wasn't like hitting accents, so it didn't feel like you were being hit over the head by the 7. It's just a great rotation, and all of a sudden I went, wait a second. And you also had a lot of 2 against 3 going on, which was also fairly subtle, because it'd be one instrument in the other, but again, having that momentum there as well.
Yeah, it's fair. It's not uncommon in film scoring to have that, and also the 7, 8, or, you know, listen to any Jerry Goldsmith soundtrack, you know. So you have lots of that, and there is also a practical reason, you know, because once you've got these sort of subdivisions, like for example with the 2 and the 3, and having them against each other, because sometimes you want to change the pace in a scene a bit, you know, so then you can either bring out the faster triplets, or you put another 4 on top, you know. It allows you to control the pace, but with still having a sort of continuous, coherent piece of music.
Sure.
The other one for this, like 7, 8 in a action scene, for example, with the action scene can be so annoying, you know, because every time, you know, then there's somebody fires a gun, then something falls, and then the car crashes, and it's all happening so quickly that basically, once you are in that kind of 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3, you know, to add another triplet or adding another 2 is like no big deal, because everything is quite sort of open and fluid, so you can make these you can just insert little extra bars of 3 8, for example, and they are not really noticed, you know. Whereas if you had a scene and you wanted to score it like just in a 4/4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. It all has to happen on the beat, and
Sure.
and then sooner or later you will run into trouble.
Oh, that's really interesting. That totally makes sense. I just hadn't thought about it in that way before. That's fun. I wanted to ask a little bit about tone, and I wasn't sure how much of this was you, how much of it was the director's guidance. It's a bit of a melancholy, bittersweet film. There's moments of joy, but there's nothing that feels super joyful. And there's a lot of moments of grief, but there's also not, it's not weighed down most of the time, if that makes sense. So there's a little bit of major in the sad stuff, and there's a little bit of minor in the happy things. Was that a decision that you decided to do yourself, or was that kind of a discussion with the director about the tone?
Well, you read the script, and in a way, there is something melancholic about that story. It's not a Jane Austen adaptation where the girls find new husbands, blah, blah, sort of. And so it is different from that, and one has to be careful not to be thinking, oh yeah, this is like an Austen drama, so let's put some little happy pizzicato, this and that. And so, because in a way, it just isn't. And then as soon as I started to see the rushes that Aisling shot, and it's very wintry and moody, and it's not this sort of happy, summery English countryside, but it's more, and all the interiors was candle lit, and it's more of a moody, grainy feel to it, so just felt like if we did anything that's too bright, it would really clash,
Yeah.
I think there is fun, there are
sure.
a few of it, and it needs some fun, when they're kind of trying on the wedding dresses.
Yes, the wedding
things
dress,
like that.
when
Yeah.
they announced that Jane is getting published for the first
Yeah,
time.
Yeah.
So it's not completely melancholy, but it was interesting that neither of the proposals had music. You didn't have your sweeping, moment because neither of them happened. So it just was really interesting to have silence in those two.
Yeah, I guess we didn't score them. I guess the bigger moments were always outside that, and then the proposals were almost more the formal sort of, it's just the words, but we sort of knew it anyway,
Always really interesting to see what gets chosen to have the accompanying, and what almost brings you in by silence as well.
There's some scenes that were shot to have music on, and then when you have something that just where the dialogue is important and does a lot, then it's sometimes better just not to. We don't need to score it,
Right.
So,
Let the words speak for themselves.
Yeah.
I was wondering, did you write the music for the ballroom, or is that something?
No,
that
well, I recorded it. It was
Okay.
something it was new arrangements of some pieces of the time.
Sure.
And then they had someone actually live on set, or kind of, at least for the visuals, but
Sure,
then they did
yeah.
some wild tracks. But then we felt like it was so... the sound was so different to the score, it just felt so, in a way, it was quite rustic. So we felt like we needed to bring it closer to the score, and then we did much more refined recording of it at Abbey
Sure.
Road, together with the rest of the score recording.
Okay, that makes sense. Just going a little bit more for that full string orchestra sound.
Well, it was both. I think we recorded, and some of it we recorded with a quartet, like you see it on the screen.
Sure.
But then I felt like actually, it can be a little bit bigger. So we then, in a separate session, we tracked the full orchestra with it as well. And then in the scene, it actually subtly transitions from one to the other.
Well, that makes sense. I remembered it starting with a string quartet and ending with an orchestra. I'll have to pay attention as it goes around. That's pretty great. Two questions that were unrelated to Miss Austen about Miss Marple. But before
Sure.
that, was there anything that you wanted to say about Miss Austen as we finish this part up?
No, I mean, no, I may remember something, but also thanks for. I mean, you really had a good look at it, and there were really interesting questions. Thanks
Oh,
for
thanks. I
paying
mean,
attention.
I love anything Austen, so I was thrilled to do this
Okay,
and to be able to
great.
watch it. I was planning on watching it anyway, so that was not a hardship whatsoever. My two questions about Miss Marple is that was 6 seasons over 9 or 10 years, correct? Or something like that.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And during that time, it was different actresses. I'm assuming different directors and different things like that. Did you find that you were one of the consistent parts of this series throughout as things were changing? And did you find that your music helped provide a kind of consistency in that regard?
Yes. I mean, it was. I mean, of course. Yeah, we had a change of lead actress, and then the directors are always different, though there was a few who did maybe three episodes, but also this series in a way is different because like one episode is 2 hours, so there it's like or 90 minutes
yeah.
without ad breaks, and so they are basically feature films, so and that's how we treated them. So the music was recorded in full pretty much for each film, and there aren't, apart from like the title theme, but the title theme doesn't actually appear very often in the series because they were very much individual, and some of them we had more with brass and horns, actually, for English countryside. So, yeah, for once. And then, so they were all quite individual and had their own themes, each of them. And that's how we sort of treated them. And it's funny because that sort of format I think it's almost died. It's probably has died out now, of a series. You know? So, because it's kind of complicated to make, and it's difficult to find a slot for it on TV, So, of course, the music was sort of uniting it because, in the end, even though I tried to make it different each time, it probably still people can tell it sort of comes from the same person. And then, of course, some of the instrumentation and some of the approach is the same. But again, I was trying to actually sort of push it forward for every new film we did.
That makes sense. The other question I had was actually putting together the album that came out. Was it 2020 or something more recently?
Around that, yeah.
How did you choose between all these different 23 episodes of trying to put together one album?
I think the idea was that this was just the first of maybe a few. And actually, I mean, it just, because that album, we tried to put one out already in like 2005. But it was always a difficult situation with the rights for that. So finally, I think the rights holders had changed or something, and I told the label, like, why don't you try again now? And then they succeeded, but still I think it took 3 years. We had so the album was finished, took another 3 years to do the paperwork for that. And I can see, like, on Spotify it's doing incredibly well. So the idea was that there's potentially a lot more that can be released, but it's just almost a matter of who is prepared to go through this again with all the paperwork.
Is that one of the reasons why some of your projects get released and some of them don't? Is it a lot more having to do with the rights for albums?
Yeah, I mean, I think more recently, I think it has become easier. So basically, we don't really have a problem, and also we've sort of found a workflow. But yes, I mean, generally that used to be the issue, and now I think it is that my management, they build in like a clause in my contract that just enables the whole soundtrack release, basically. I mean, it's not that I have the rights, but that at least we can do it without too much trouble.
Sure.
So,
that makes sense.
And the deal is kind of already fixed in advance, and then there is no further lawyers and discussions needed, you know. So
I think that's something that a lot of listeners are not aware of. I know that there's a lot of people who want things from the miniseries of some of the Jane Austen ones or other miniseries that were especially in the 2000s. And it was in that weird season of we're not really streaming yet, but like CDs were a little too maybe expensive to mass produce. It does feel like sometimes it's the rights and sometimes just in that decade of harder to get out there.
Of course, because now what's happening now is that we can just plan an album and just for a digital release, and then I've had it that with some series they just become really huge hits, or the soundtrack becomes really huge, and then we can add on the CD and vinyl and the purple vinyl colored and everything later on, you know. So
see how it goes first
whereas you were quite right with this sort of in 20 years ago, it was probably just to then plan, because somebody had to then pay, you know, for the CD and printing, and particularly it was always the artwork and the booklets that were actually more expensive. So somebody had to put up all this money up front, and you didn't know, you know, because sometimes the series it could be that it's a complete flop, you know, and then they will have wasted more money, you know. So and also normally it's not the production that ever deals with these soundtrack releases, it's dedicated soundtrack labels, you know, and so they don't want to take on unnecessary risk, of course. You know.
I have one more question for you, and then that will be it. And that question is, what are you listening to right now? I know that sometimes composers are very much in their own music, so they want to have silence. But is there anything that you are enjoying to listen to?
I don't know. I'll just call up my Spotify.
Oh, that works great.
Recently liked songs. Oh, there's some new. Oh, whatever. I'm listening to some Joshua Bell violin, Kronos quartets, and then Nile Rodgers, Vivaldi violin concerto, and then Brahms, Tame Impala, Australian psychedelic rock, and then 1980s German pop music. Then, so these are kind of just sort of on my more recent. I listen to also I like a lot of kind of 1970s soul, funk, disco. That's my sort of a lot of the time my sort of go-to chill out music. Then some, I don't know, I've got some Talking Heads. I don't really listen to a lot of soundtracks, actually. I'm just realizing. But I've just come across one that I'm listening to is, you know, Alberto Iglesias. So in fact, he's probably maybe my favorite film composer. So I've got that on my recent liked list, and then the Philip Glass. So anyway, this is a sort of, you get a kind of real time. Anyway, so, and then I like listening to, you know, I've got here Irrepressibles. They're like a London art house band, and got some Tom Waits on there, Nancy Sinatra. Yeah. Anyway,
that's great. It's just always fascinating to hear what people are listening to. Recent, not recent.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much for talking to me about this.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks so much.
Thanks again to Dominik for joining World of Soundtracks. You can follow him on Instagram at Dominik with a K _G_Scherrer, as well as finding his music on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you find your music. You can also follow the World of Soundtracks on our Facebook page, as well as Twitter and Instagram at WO Soundtracks. Please like and subscribe, share with friends, and even leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon. I highly recommend subscribing so you don't miss when the next episode comes out. If you're in the Chicago area this summer of 2025, I will be giving some soundtrack classes, Star Wars, Harry Potter, Jane Austen, How to Train Your Dragon in person. So feel free to contact me through Instagram, through Facebook, or my website, ruthmudge.com. We'd love to see you there. Until next time, happy listening. A special thanks to all those involved to make this podcast happen, especially Edith Mudge for the title music, Lindsay Bergsma for the graphics, and White Bear PR for setting up the interview with Dominik. This is World of Soundtracks.